The Verith Nexus was not a place that cared about feelings. It was a place of power. It was a massive station that floated between 3 star systems, built over hundreds of years by the older galactic species. Every wall, every corridor, every meeting room had been designed to remind visitors of one simple truth: some species mattered more than others. Ethan Cole had known this before he even stepped off the transport shuttle. He had read every report, every briefing, every note that Earth's diplomatic bureau had sent him. He knew the history of the Nexus. He knew which species sat at the top of the council table and which ones were lucky to get a seat at all. He knew that humans were the newest addition to the galactic community, and that most of the older species had not exactly rolled out a welcome mat. He was 34 years old, lean, with short brown hair and dark eyes that tended to notice things quietly. He did not walk into rooms with the kind of energy that demanded attention. He walked in like someone who was simply there to do a job. His junior attaché, Lena Marsh, walked beside him as they made their way through the wide glass corridors of the Nexus on the morning of Earth's first formal trade presentation. Lena was 26, sharp, and fast on her feet. She had spent 2 years studying galactic diplomacy before this posting. She had memorized every piece of protocol, every cultural sensitivity note, every small rule about how to greet which species and what gestures to avoid. She was well prepared. But she was also nervous in a way she was trying not to show. Ethan was not nervous. Or if he was, nobody could tell. The council chamber was enormous. It had a curved ceiling that caught the light from the star outside and scattered it across the room in long golden lines. There were hundreds of seats arranged in a wide arc, and most of them were occupied. Delegates from across the galaxy had gathered for the standard morning session. Earth's trade proposal was item 7 on the agenda, not exactly a priority slot. Ethan stood at the central podium and began to speak. His voice was calm and measured. He explained Earth's proposal clearly: a trade corridor through the Saren Belt that would benefit multiple species and reduce the travel time for freight by almost 30%. It was a good proposal. He had spent 6 months helping to build it. The data was solid, the numbers were honest, and the offer was fair. He was 4 minutes into the presentation when Xyrath Valos interrupted him. Xyrath was the senior delegate of the Crethean Dominion. The Cretheans were a reptilian species, tall and broad, with layered scales that shifted color depending on their mood. They had held significant influence over the Council for 3 centuries. Xyrath herself had been in this chamber for longer than some of the smaller galactic nations had existed. She sat at the center of the arc, in the most prominent seat, and she had the kind of stillness that came from never having been told no. She spoke first in her native tongue, a long, fluid stream of sound that the translation systems needed a few seconds to process. It was not an accident. The entire room heard her speak, watched her tone, read her body language, and understood the dismissal before the words even reached Ethan's earpiece. The translation came through. She had called Earth's proposal a document written by species who had only recently learned to leave their own atmosphere. She said that the Saren Belt was not a toy for shelf warmers who confused noise for negotiation. She said that humans had been admitted to the Council as a courtesy, not because anyone actually expected them to contribute anything useful. The laughter started before Ethan had finished hearing it. Lena felt her face go hot. She was standing just behind the podium, and she could feel the sound of that laughter like something physical. She looked at Ethan, expecting him to respond, expecting some kind of reaction: anger, embarrassment, a stumbled attempt to recover. Ethan did not do any of those things. He stood at the podium for a moment in complete silence. Not the silence of someone who was shocked or hurt. The silence of someone who was thinking clearly and making a deliberate choice. Then he closed his document folio. He straightened the collar of his jacket. He looked out at the council chamber without hostility or shame, and he said, in a voice that carried just far enough to be heard, that he thanked the council for their time today. And then he walked out. Not fast. Not storming out in anger. He walked at a normal pace, steady and unhurried, like someone who had simply finished what they came to do and was moving on to the next thing. Lena scrambled to follow him, nearly knocking over a stack of data tablets as she went. Behind them, the chamber buzzed with murmuring. Some delegates looked confused. Some looked amused. The Soren elder seated near the back of the chamber tilted his head and watched the door long after Ethan had passed through it. Xyrath leaned back in her seat. She allowed herself a small, satisfied expression. She had expected the human to stumble over his words, or to get red in the face, or to make some awkward attempt at formal protest. She had not expected him to simply leave. But it did not matter. The result was the same. He was gone, the room had laughed, and the Crethean Dominion had made its position perfectly clear. She did not think about him again that morning. Ethan and Lena walked down the long corridor outside the chamber. For a while neither of them spoke. Their footsteps echoed on the polished floor. A cleaning unit hummed past them and disappeared around a corner. Finally Lena said, quietly and carefully, that she was not sure what had just happened. Ethan was quiet for another few steps. Then he said that something useful had just happened. She looked at him. He was already thinking about something else. She could tell by the way his eyes had gone slightly distant, the way they did when he was working through a problem. He was not angry. He was not embarrassed. He looked, if anything, like someone who had just been handed a very important piece of information. And in a way, he had. The next morning, Ethan did not go to the council chamber. There was a standard session scheduled, routine agenda items, a vote on a minor shipping regulation, nothing that required his presence. He filed a polite absence notice with the council secretary's office and spent the morning in his assigned quarters instead, reading through a stack of old trade records that nobody had looked at in years. He was not sulking. He was working. Lena figured this out by the afternoon of the first day. She had expected him to be upset, or at least visibly unsettled. She had spent half the night lying awake in her own quarters thinking about what had happened in that chamber. The laughter, the dismissal, the way Xyrath had spoken before the translation even came through, making sure the whole room understood before Ethan did. It had been deliberate and cruel. Lena kept replaying it. But when she came to check on Ethan in the morning, he was already dressed, already calm, already focused. He had a cup of coffee in one hand and a datapad in the other, and he was reading something about the Pulhari trading routes from about 40 years ago. She asked him what he was doing. He told her he was learning things. That afternoon, he sent a quiet message to the Pulhari delegation asking if their senior trade advisor had any time for a brief conversation. The Pulhari were a small species, thin and pale, with long fingers and a careful way of moving that reminded Lena of people who had learned to be very quiet in a very loud world. They had been members of the Galactic Council for decades, but they were never in the main conversation. They sat near the edges of the chamber, voted occasionally, and were largely left alone. The Pulhari advisor, a soft-spoken individual named Orath, seemed genuinely surprised to receive the message. He agreed to meet. They met in a small lounge near the middle section of the Nexus, one of the spaces that was not really associated with any particular species. Ethan arrived first and had already ordered tea for both of them. He had looked up what the Pulhari drank. Orath noticed this. He sat down and looked at the tea for a moment before looking at Ethan, and something in his expression shifted slightly. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Ethan asked questions about the Pulhari trade routes, about which parts of the Saren Belt corridor would benefit the most, about what their actual freight problems were. He listened carefully. He did not offer solutions or promises. He just listened and asked more questions. Lena sat in the corner of the lounge and watched. The next day, Ethan did the same thing with the Soren Collective's junior delegate, a young individual named Sev who spent most council sessions sitting quietly in the back row. The day after that, he met with 2 representatives from the Duskan traders, a traveling species with no permanent planet who conducted most of their business along the very routes that the Saren Belt corridor would pass through. He did not attend the council chamber on any of those days. He did not file any formal protest about what Xyrath had done. He did not speak to any journalist or press contact. He did not send any strongly worded messages to the Crethean delegation. He did nothing that would look like retaliation, because it was not retaliation. It was something else entirely. Back in the Crethean section of the Nexus, Xyrath received 3 separate reports from her aides about Ethan's movements. Each report said more or less the same thing. The human diplomat was spending his time meeting with minor delegates. Her senior aide suggested this might be an attempt to build sympathy or to gather allies for a formal complaint. Xyrath dismissed the idea. There was nothing to complain about formally. She had spoken in a council session. That was permitted. If the human wanted to cry to the Pulhari about his hurt feelings, that was his business. She had bigger things to think about. The Crethean Dominion was pushing for an expansion of their patrol rights in the Saren Belt, and the vote was scheduled for the end of the station cycle. It was going to pass easily. It always did. Orath, the Polhari trade advisor, said something to his senior delegate that evening that was worth noting. He said that in 40 years of attending council sessions, no senior delegate from any major species had ever asked to hear their freight concerns directly. Not once. He said it quietly, the way he said most things, but his senior delegate listened carefully. The Soren Collective's young delegate Sev went back to his quarters that evening and wrote a long message to his home council describing the conversation he had with the human diplomat. He noted that the human had not asked for anything. He had not made any offers or deals. He had only asked questions, and he had seemed genuinely interested in the answers. Sev wrote that this was unusual. He wrote that it was, in fact, the most unusual thing that had happened to him since he arrived at the Nexus. Lena wrote her own notes each evening, trying to keep up with what Ethan was doing and why. She had studied diplomacy for 2 years. She understood the theory of coalition building, of finding common interests, of turning scattered smaller players into a unified bloc. She understood it academically. Watching Ethan do it in practice was something different. He never used any of the language she had been taught. He did not say things like mutual interests or strategic alignment. He just asked people about their problems and listened to the answers. He remembered the names of their children when they were mentioned in passing. He looked people in the eye when they talked, regardless of what they looked like or how important they were. On the 4th day, she finally asked him directly, was he building something? Was there a plan? He thought about the question for a moment. Then he said that he was not sure he would call it a plan. He said that mostly he was just trying to understand the place before he tried to do anything in it. She looked at him for a long moment. She was starting to think that was exactly the point. The vote was set for the last day of the station cycle, when all delegations were required to be present. It was a formal session, full attendance, recorded proceedings, official results logged into the Council's permanent record. The item on the agenda was the reallocation of patrol rights across the Saren Belt, which in plain terms meant the Crethean Dominion was asking for control over the most valuable stretch of the corridor. It was not the first time they had asked for something like this. It was not even the 5th. The Cretheans had been expanding their influence steadily for decades, one vote at a time, and the reason they kept winning was simple. They were powerful, well-organized, and most of the council either supported them or did not see a reason to push back. Xyrath arrived at the chamber that morning looking the way she always looked. Composed. Certain. She greeted a few of her allies near the entrance, exchanged a few quiet words with her senior aide, and took her seat at the center of the arc. The chamber filled slowly around her. Ethan arrived quietly and took his seat at the far end of the floor. He had come back to the chamber for the first time since he walked out. He was dressed the same way he always was, neat, unremarkable, a human diplomat doing his job. Lena sat beside him. She had a tablet on her lap, but she was not reading it. The morning session ran through the usual business. Small items, procedural matters, a brief dispute between 2 minor species about water extraction rights on a shared moon. Ethan sat through all of it without comment, occasionally making a note on his own tablet. When the patrol rights vote came up, Xyrath stood to deliver her opening statement. She was brief and direct, the way she always was when she expected something to be easy. The Crethean Dominion had maintained security in the region for decades, she said. Expanding their patrol zone was a natural extension of that responsibility. It would benefit everyone. 2 of the major species spoke in support. A third offered a mild statement of approval. Everything was moving exactly as expected. Then the voting opened. Each delegation submitted their vote through the council system. A simple yes or no, recorded in real time and displayed on a screen at the front of the chamber. The results built slowly as delegates voted in sequence according to their registration order. The Crethean bloc voted yes, as expected. The 2 major allies voted yes. Then the Polhari delegation voted. They voted no. Xyrath's aide glanced at her. She kept her expression neutral. One unexpected vote was not a problem. The Soren Collective voted no. The Duskan traders voted no. 3 more small delegations voted no in quick succession. Earth's delegation voted no. The chamber was very quiet now. Everyone was watching the screen. The numbers were close in a way that had not happened in 11 years. When the final votes came in and the tally settled, The result was clear: the motion had failed. Not by one vote. By enough votes that there was no ambiguity. Xyrath sat very still. Her aide leaned over and said something quietly. She did not respond. She was looking at the screen. She had seen council votes go against the Crethean Dominion before. It happened occasionally, on minor issues, when something was genuinely unpopular. But those times, there was always a visible reason. A public dispute. A strongly worded statement from someone. A deal that had been made in the open. There was none of that here. The delegations that had voted against her had not announced anything. They had not coordinated publicly. There was no trail of meetings in the official records, no formal alliance registered, no open conversation that anyone could point to. Her aide tried to suggest that perhaps it was a coincidence, several delegations simply arriving at the same conclusion independently. Xyrath looked at him for a moment, and he stopped talking. She turned her gaze to the far end of the chamber floor. Ethan was still sitting where he had been sitting all morning. He had his tablet in front of him, and he was already looking at the next item on the agenda. He was not looking at Xyrath. He was not looking at the screen. He was not looking at anything except the work in front of him, as though the vote had been a small administrative detail, and now it was time to move on. Around him, the delegates from the Polhari, the Soren Collective, and the Duskan traders were also returning to their normal positions. No celebration, no visible acknowledgement, no sign of anything unusual having taken place. Lena, sitting beside Ethan, allowed herself exactly one small breath of satisfaction. It was the kind that she was careful to keep entirely inside, where no one could see it. The council chair announced the result formally and moved the session forward. The next item was about mapping rights in a distant region that had nothing to do with the Saren Belt. Ethan read it carefully and made a note. Xyrath sat through the rest of the session without speaking. Her aides exchanged careful glances. Something had happened, and none of them fully understood it yet. They had lost a vote they were supposed to win by a comfortable margin, and the defeat had come from delegations they had never thought to worry about. In the back row of the chamber, the Soren delegate Sev sat with his hands folded and looked calm. The Polhari advisor Orath, seated nearby, did not look at anyone in particular. The Duskan representatives had returned to their normal quiet posture. Nothing about any of them suggested that they had done anything coordinated or unusual. And that, more than anything else, was what Xyrath could not stop thinking about. Xyrath found him alone that evening. It was not something she had planned. She had spent the afternoon in meetings with her aides, reviewing the vote breakdown and trying to understand what had gone wrong. The more she looked at it, the less sense it made in the way she was used to things making sense. No deals in the open record. No promises. No leverage she could identify. Just a collection of small delegations who had voted the same way for no visible reason. She had told her aides she was going to review the archive files and had walked toward the council archive wing. But she had seen Ethan ahead of her in the corridor, walking alone in the direction of the same wing, and something in her had made a decision before she fully knew she was making it. She caught up to him near the entrance to the archive corridor, where the lighting was softer and the foot traffic had thinned out for the evening. Most of the station's busier areas were behind them now. She said his name, not his title, just his name, and he stopped walking and turned around. He looked at her with the same expression he always seemed to have. Calm, present, not particularly surprised. She had seen humans in difficult conversations before. Most of them reacted to her presence with some form of visible tension, a straightening of posture, a slight tightening around the eyes. Ethan did none of that. He looked at her the way he might look at someone he had been expecting to run into eventually. She asked him, without any formal preamble, what he had said to those delegations. There was a pause. Not a defensive pause. More like someone taking a moment to think carefully before speaking, which was already different from most of what she encountered in the Nexus. He said he had not told them anything. She watched his face for signs of dishonesty. She was very good at reading faces, across many species. He was not lying. She could tell. But the answer was not satisfying, and she said so. She told him that the Polhari had never voted against the Crethean Dominion on a patrol rights issue. Not once in 12 years. And the Soren Collective had been abstaining on belt matters since before Sev was even assigned to the council. Something had changed, and the only new variable she could identify was him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had asked them questions. She waited. He said that the Sarin Belt proposal Earth had brought to the Council was never just about trade routes for humanity. It was about what kind of access the smaller species would have in that corridor, whether they would have a fair partner, or just another powerful nation cutting through their territory and calling it progress. So he had asked the Polhari what their actual freight problems were. He had asked the Sorin Collective what a functioning corridor would need to look like for them. He had asked the Duskan traders what they had been trying to get done for years that nobody had helped them with. He said the answers were very interesting. Xyrath felt something she did not particularly like feeling. It was not quite anger, though there was some of that. It was more like the particular discomfort of being shown a gap you did not know existed. She told him that what he had done sounded like manipulation. Building sympathy to move votes. That was not principled diplomacy. It was politics dressed up as kindness. He looked at her for a moment. There was no heat in his expression. No defensiveness. When he spoke, his voice was even and unhurried. He said that what she was describing was called diplomacy. He said it was the oldest form of it, in fact, listening to people, understanding their problems, and finding ways to help that also helped you. He said it was not manipulation to actually mean what you said. He said that the smaller delegations had voted the way they voted because their concerns were real, and someone had finally taken the time to understand them. He paused. Then he said, quietly and without cruelty, that if that process had felt unfamiliar or surprising in this chamber, that was probably worth reflecting on. Xyrath stood very still. She had walked into this conversation expecting to feel the satisfaction of catching him in something, of forcing him to admit to some kind of scheme. Instead, she was standing in a quiet corridor being told, politely and without aggression, that she had spent years winning votes by being powerful rather than by being useful, and that somewhere along the way she had stopped noticing the difference. She wanted to argue. She had the words for it. She was exceptionally good at arguing. But the thing that made her stop was that she could not identify a single factual error in what he had said. She tried a different direction. She told him that he had walked out of that council session, that walking out in the middle of a formal presentation was a statement, an act of protest, and that he was pretending now to have operated from pure principle when really he had been responding to what she did. He thought about that. He did not deny it immediately, which she had not expected. Then he said that she might be right about that. He said that walking out had been a choice, and he had made it. But he said the conversations he had with the smaller delegations afterward were not about what had happened in that chamber. They were about them. Their work, their routes, their problems. He said those conversations would have been worth having regardless of anything else. He wished her a good evening. And then he walked away from her, at the same unhurried pace he always moved at, and turned down the corridor toward the archive wing without looking back. Xyrath stood where she was for a long time. The corridor was very quiet. A ventilation unit hummed somewhere above her. Light from the star outside filtered through a small panel in the wall and made a thin line across the floor. She stood there until the light shifted, and then she walked back the way she had come. She did not speak to anyone for the rest of the evening. 3 months later, Ethan was back on Earth. The orbital diplomatic hub sat above the planet like a quiet thought, small compared to the Verith Nexus, functional rather than grand, built more for work than for impression. It was where Earth's diplomatic bureau operated its day-to-day business, and it was where Ethan spent his time between postings writing reports, reviewing incoming data, and occasionally eating lunch with other diplomats who were also between postings. He had been back for 6 weeks when the bureau director, a steady woman named Carol Wynne, called him in for a review meeting. These meetings were standard. Every returning diplomat sat down with their director and went through what had happened, what had worked, what had not worked, and what should be done differently next time. Carol had read every report, including Lena's, which was thorough and clear and quite a bit more detailed than most junior attaché reports tended to be. She sat across from Ethan in a small office with a view of the planet below and went through the key points one by one. She told him that the Sarin Belt corridor vote was being discussed at a level above her pay grade. The fact that Earth's first formal trade proposal had ended with a coalition vote that blocked a Crethian expansion, without any formal alliance, without any deals in the open record, without any complaints or protests or public statements, had caught the attention of people who paid attention to such things. Ethan said that the credit belonged to the smaller delegations. They had voted their own interests. He had only asked them what those interests were. Carol looked at him for a moment and then continued going through her notes. What she did not say in the meeting, but what was becoming true at a level that she was tracking carefully, was that word had started moving through the smaller galactic species. Not in an official way. Not in press statements or formal dispatches. In the way that things moved through communities that were used to being overlooked, quietly, carefully, through trusted channels. The word was simple: humans listen. Not in a transactional way, where listening was a technique used to get something. In a way that felt like actual interest. The Polhari trade advisor Orith had mentioned Ethan in a message to 3 other minor delegations he communicated with regularly. He had not used strong language or made big claims. He had simply said that the human diplomat had asked him real questions and remembered the answers, and that this had been noticeable. The Soren Collective's young delegate Sev had written a longer account in his report to his home council. He had said that in his experience at the Nexus, most major species diplomats treated the minor delegations as background noise, present but not relevant, useful occasionally for vote counts but not worth actual engagement. He said the human had been different not because he had made promises or offered deals, but because he had seemed genuinely curious about people he had no obvious reason to be curious about. These reports circulated. Other minor species read them. A few sent quiet inquiries to Earth's diplomatic bureau, nothing formal, just openings, the kind of tentative reaching out that happened when someone wanted to know if a door was open before they tried to walk through it. Carol noted all of this in her own files. Meanwhile, Lena had finished writing her official report and was now working on something longer. A personal account that she was not sure what she was going to do with, but that she kept adding to because she felt that what she had watched at the Nexus was worth recording properly. She wrote about the moment Ethan had walked out of the chamber. She wrote about the 4 days of quiet meetings in corridor lounges. She wrote about the vote, and the silence in the chamber afterward, and Zyratha's face. At one point she asked Ethan directly, she had been trying to ask this for weeks, whether he had thought of Zyratha's words in that first session as an insult. He thought about it for a while before answering, which was typical. He did not give quick answers to questions he thought deserved real consideration. He said that he had not thought of it as an insult, exactly. He said that insults were a category he found less useful than information. When someone treated you as unimportant, or spoke over you, or laughed at your work, that told you something real about them, how they operated, what they valued, what they thought power looked like. He said that Zyrath had shown him, in about 30 seconds, everything he needed to know about how the Crethean Dominion had been doing business in that chamber for 3 centuries. He said that was useful. Lena wrote that down. When Ethan returned to the Verith Nexus for the next posting cycle, the session opened the same way it always did. The chamber filled, the chair called the meeting to order, and the delegates took their seats. Ethan arrived and was greeted, quietly and without fanfare, by a small group of delegates near the far end of the floor. Orith was there, and Sev, and 2 of the Duskan traders. A representative from a species called the Verhan, who had never spoken directly to any Earth diplomat before, was also there. She had asked Orith to introduce her. They spoke for a few minutes before the session started, the way people speak when they are comfortable with each other. Ethan asked Orith about a freight route issue that Orith had mentioned 3 months ago, in the first conversation they had ever had. Orith looked slightly surprised to be remembered, and then looked as though he was trying not to show that he was pleased. Zyrath arrived and took her seat. She looked, as always, composed. She had spent the past 3 months doing what she always did, managing the Crethean Dominion's affairs with precision and authority. She had not lost any major votes since the Belt decision. She had continued operating from the same position of power she had always occupied. But she watched Ethan cross the floor and sit down among those small delegations, and she understood something now that she had not understood 3 months ago. She had expected that walking out of her chamber would mean something. She had expected the human to react the way everyone reacted when the Cretheans made their position clear, with scrambling, or complaint, or defeated retreat. She had expected him to want something from her, an apology, a concession, acknowledgement of some kind. What she had not expected was someone who genuinely did not need any of that. Not because he was performing indifference. Not because he was suppressing something. But because the approval of the most powerful person in the room had simply not been the point for him, and had never been the point, and so losing it, or in this case, never having it, did not change anything about how he operated. The session opened. The council chair began going through the agenda. Ethan opened his folio, greeted the delegates around him by name, and got to work. He did not look at Xyrath. Not because he was avoiding her. Just because there was nothing in that direction that he needed.